Right. Oh, well, good morning, everybody. Back again. Here we go again. This morning, it's blue and white, which is actually blue and white pottery, as you've probably guessed. As you all know, one of the first things you see as you come through the front door is the display of pottery on the dresser. And it's been there a long time. Unlike most of the things in the house, I've not moved that in all the time that I've been here. This is partly because that dresser is so firmly screwed to the wall that it's impossible to move, but also because the blue and white is such an easily recognized symbol. Everybody knows the blue and white. It's a nice, gentle introduction to the museum. So that's what I should be talking about this morning. The Chinese were making blue and white porcelain in the early 15th century, about the same time that this house was built. They used cobalt blue because it was one of the few colors that would survive the temperatures that were necessary in the kiln. But it was expensive and very little of it worked its way to Europe, particularly Northern Europe, until 1603, when a ship of the Dutch East Indies Company captured a Portuguese carrack called the Santa Catarina off Singapore. And that was carrying something like 100,000 pieces of blue and white porcelain. The following year, the cargo was auctioned in Amsterdam, and this caused a great surge of interest in everything Oriental, and particularly in blue and white pottery. But it was only for the wealthy, only for the rich at that point. European potters tried to copy the Chinese porcelain with limited success in the early days. We became very good at it in the end, but in the early days where there were problems of getting European kilns up to the temperatures necessary to fire porcelain. The nearest equivalent for many years was tin glazed earthenware, like this one behind me here. This was a process that was developed in England, but was very popular in Holland. So it's a type of pottery that is nowadays normally called Delft, but this one is English Delft, made in, well, probably Bristol, could be Leeds or Liverpool, could be any of them, but made in around 1760. This one hand decorated, hand painted, very much in the Chinese style, but by someone who'd never been outside this country. So it's not quite what you would expect to see on a truly Chinese plate. This is a wonderful thing, and I can't bring it any closer to the screen because it is in very bad condition. It is in about a dozen pieces being held together from habit and cobwebs, I think. But this one belongs to me. That one does not belong to the museum. But this blue and white pottery was very popular. And there's still quite a lot of it around. It does survive. But there was a rising demand for blue and white, largely because of the increase in the drinking of tea, and people wanted their tea sets to go with it. Still expensive, still beyond most people's pocket. But in, so I have to check the date on this one. If you see me looking down, it's because I'm checking a date. I do apologize. But in 1761, Dr. John Wall at Worcester developed a process for transfer printing on pottery, which made it cheaper. He could not do this on earthenware, but he could do this on porcelain. More porous earthenware would not take the transfers at that time. But Thomas Turner at Hoathly did finally develop a process to transfer a print on earthenware, and that made it much cheaper and much more readily available. Josiah Spode perfected this process, and he was making transfer printed earthenware in Staffordshire in 1784, which was a big year. 1784 is important because it is the year when the duty on tea was dropped considerably, making tea even more popular. They raised the excise duty on silver, so silver teapots became more expensive, so pottery teapots were a better option. They also increased export duty on Chinese porcelain, which made Chinese porcelain even more expensive, so English potteries had to step in to fill the gap. The East India companies were also stopping bringing in porcelain at that point because they wanted to concentrate on tea. So it all comes back to tea and our habit of tea drinking. But from 1784 onwards, there were factories all over the country producing blue and white transfer printed pottery in vast quantities. and shipping it all over the world. It was popular in Europe. It was also popular in America and Canada, and a lot of blue and white pottery from Staffordshire ended up in America. They produced their own designs over there, but they also liked the traditional ones. There was an increase in demand for local views, so you do get the picturesque English views at the end of the 18th century. But the blue and white Oriental patterns were still popular, and the most popular one of all, of course, is this one, which is instantly recognizable as the good old willow pattern. Nobody knows quite how long the willow pattern has been produced. It was probably designed by Thomas Minton for Turner at Hoathly in the 1780s, but nobody is quite sure. He probably took elements from other Chinese patterns to produce this, principally the Mandarin pattern, which is a well-recorded Chinese pattern. And he added the bow. I have to do this back to front because I'm not looking in the mirror image of myself. He added the bridge and enlarged the pavilion and added the fence, all taken for other elements. And he really cut and pasted this, put it together, and had an instant hit. And nobody can quite explain why. When he left Hoathly, he went to other factories and he produced this design for other factories, always with a slight variation. So that's why there are so many different types of willow. The biggest variation tends to be in the birds. This pattern, when you see that, it'll go blurred. These birds are known as fishtail in that form, and that does tend to be quite early. And this plate is around about 1830, something like that. But I'd say the blue and white was always the thing. It was readily available. Almost everybody could afford this. And though some people question why we have a dresser full of willow pattern pottery inside the front door, we know that it is appropriate for the house because I dig broken bits of this out of the garden quite regularly. So we know for certain that this was used here. And it was used in pretty well every household in the country, which is why everybody knows this. They did try it in other colors. You will find some reddish pink willow pattern, green, not in large quantities, and they even made black willow pattern. But that was never very popular. The blue and white was always the one, and it remained the easiest color to fire until the 1830s. So at that point, we were producing porcelain and had been really since the middle of the 18th century, but still expensive. This was cheap. The legend that goes with this, which everybody knows the story, although there are several different variations on it. The story goes back to about 1849. It does not go back to the origins of the plate. So this is not an old Chinese fairy tale. The Mandarin pattern and the other patterns that this is taken from may well come from old Chinese fairy tales, but the story of the lovers escaping the jealous father and escaping over the bridge was probably a 19th century marketing ploy to sell even more of this, and it worked. I'm not going to read out the story. Everybody knows the story, but as I say, it's not an old one. Even though this was cheap, it was a complicated process to produce transfer printing. I shall put this down now. I'll get our make. The engraver would produce the original design, or the designer would produce the original design on tissue paper. It was then transferred using a form of carbon paper to a copper plate. That could then be engraved. The deeper they engraved the copper plate, the darker the blue would be. So early plates tend to be very even. The blue is all the same color, but later ones, they became more sophisticated, so you get greater depth of color. And that all came down to the engraving. When the plate was engraved, it was covered with the ink, blue ink normally, put on a hot plate. It fits better in a hot plate. You remove the excess. They then took a piece of fiber-free tissue paper coated with a mixture of soft soap and water. That was applied to the plate. The plate was then passed through a set of rollers. You have a hard wooden roller underneath, and a softer roller on top, which was normally covered in a thick layer of flannel. Pass the plate and the tissue through the rollers. That transfers the picture, so you get a reverse image. You then cut off the excess from the transfer and apply it to the plate. And this is where the skill really comes in, putting a flat tissue image on a three-dimensional plate. They would work the image into the plate using a stiff bristled brush. Excuse me, I have a drink of water here so I can get my words out. I've barely spoken to anyone for the last month, so I do apologize about this. I say the voice just isn't working properly. You apply the color, so with a stiff bristle brush, it could then be soaked in water. The water would take off the remains of the transfer, the remains of the tissue. The ink was oil-based, so that wouldn't wash off. This was then fired at something like 700 degrees centigrade, taken out, dipped in glaze, then refired at about 1100. Porcelain needs something like 1200, but earthenware fire at just under 1100. And that's your plate. They were stacked in the kilns in saggers. Every pottery had a sagger maker, and his apprentice, who used to, you know what's coming, Sophie? His apprentice who used to beat out the clay into a mold really was called the sagger maker's bottom knocker. I'm not making that up. There really was such a job, a sagger maker's bottom knocker. An old trade, much maligned, and there are none of them left. But the saggers were important. The plates were stacked in the kiln face down, and to keep them separate, they would use spacers. These were cockspurs, and a cockspur is a ring of hardened ceramic with three little legs, 3 points on the bottom and a single point on the top. And the plates, they being stacked face down, you will see the cockspur marks on them, and you can see and feel the marks around the edge. There we go, there's one there because I can feel it, I don't need to see it. So you got a single mark in 3 places on the front of the plate, and on the back of the plate, you get 3 sets of 3 marks. Excuse me, there we go. You see that there are 3 marks there. They're the cockspur marks. There's another 3 marks up there, and there's another 3 marks here. Every plate would have those except the one on the top, which doesn't have the marks on the back. More expensive wares were supported in the kiln slightly differently, so you don't see these marks on more expensive wares. But if you do find them on a plate, it is a reasonable indication of age, because you will not find them on modern plates at all, only on 18th and 19th century ones. So they do leave their marks quite literally. If they overfired the plate or overglazed it, the blue could blur, and you end up with something called flow blue. And that one is a very extreme form of flow blue. And you can see possibly, it will blur itself just from the camera if I'm not careful, that this is a very blurred image. It is not a sharp image. They worked out eventually that people liked it this way, so they would blur it deliberately by adding a flow mix to the kiln. And this is normally a mixture of salt and chalk, borax and white lead. Flow blue is particularly popular in America. There are a lot of collectors for it in America even today. But so this is a very exaggerated form. And this one is quite an old plate. That will date from around 1810, something like that. Unmarked, the vast majority is unmarked. By 1865, over 250 factories were making willow pattern, and most of them didn't bother to mark it, which is very frustrating, particularly on something like this. There were plenty of other patterns. This is known as, going a bit closer, this is the crouching leopard pattern. You see the crouching leopard pattern, crouching leopard there, and there's a deer here. This one shows the technical difficulties of putting on the transfer because it's a very sharp curve. And to get it round this corner, they've had to fold and crease the transfer. And it's quite ugly as you go around the corner here. And there are white gaps where the transfer hasn't quite met. as well, which again is an indication of age. You on modern willow, and they still make it today, you will not find these gaps. They just don't send them out if they do make a mistake. But as I say, this is the crouching leopard pattern. And the problem with this is that absolutely nobody knows who made it because it is never marked. So although it is reasonably common, even an expert couldn't tell you who made this. And I'm certainly not an expert, but I do like the blue and white. And it's still popular today. And hopefully at some point in the spring, you'll be able to come back and see it all because it'll all still be there because I still haven't managed to move that dresser. So thank you very much. A short one today, but we will have another go before Christmas. I've no idea what it'll be about because I haven't decided yet, but thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Even though you've just destroyed the myth of the lovers fleeing over the bridge.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, there is some debate. If you look online, you will see people saying it is actually a Chinese fairy tale, and there is some truth to it. There may be, but it's probable that the fairy tale attaches to the Mandarin pattern rather than the willow pattern. So who knows? But it's nice to be able to make up your own stories. Why not?
That's a lovely story.
You can make up your own story for the crouching leopard pattern. So, I don't think there is one for that one.
Yeah, will it end well for either? Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? Deathly silence.
Have I stunned everybody?
Anthony, can I ask, was the clay for all the pottery, did that all come from Cornwall, or were there other sources around the country?
There were other sources, yes. The best china clay for porcelain comes from Cornwall. That's the kaolin. I think if you've been to the Eden project is set in an old china clay pit.
Yes, yes.
But for the earthenwares, they would use the local clays, local availability. So you see a little bit of variation in the body. It's one reason why Staffordshire became the centre of pottery, was that they had a good supply of good clays there. But yeah, different makers use different clays, so you will find some variation in the body. And you do get, with porcelain, you get the variation between the true Oriental Chinese porcelain, which is known as hard paste, and the early European potteries, which are soft paste, which aren't so hard wearing. They're both based on kaolin, but they just have different constituents. And soft paste can have things like bone ash, which is where your bone china comes from. It does actually have genuine bone ash in it. Wow. So soft paste is not anywhere near as hard wearing as hard paste, but it's easier to make because, again, it comes down to the firing temperature. Soft paste porcelain fires at slightly lower temperature, and the European kilns just couldn't produce high temperatures originally. So we got there in the end, but it took a little while for us to work out how to do it. But ultimately, with Wedgwood and Spode and whatever, we did become quite good at it. Sorry, does that answer, Richard?
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you.
I don't know how many china clay mines pits are left in Cornwall. When I was at school, we went to visit one. They're strange places, quite eerie places.
It's the mounds that I remember from my childhood.
Yeah.
Slag heaps or whatever they are equivalent.
Yes, yeah, and it's this strange pale grey landscape. Yeah, it is quite peculiar. Yeah, this was this old school field trip. This was which was a very long time ago. But I don't think we went to the one that the Eden project in, but I'm pretty sure that is built in a kaolin mine, kaolin pit.
I think there's when we went to Mevagissi a few years ago, the sea had been coloured by this china clay running down into the harbour. It was the most amazing sort of opal colour. So presumably there was one somewhere up in the Heligan area as well, but I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sure there would have been, yeah.
With the ink, did each manufacturer make their own ink, or was somebody producing it centrally as you got to the Industrial Revolution?
That I don't know. I suspect so in the early days they were all making their own. And they probably stayed that way, but I don't honestly know. Perhaps for the smaller ones, they did have to buy it in, but certainly with Spode and Wedgwood and all the big names, Davenport, so on, they will be making their own.
Thank you.
I imagine. I say I don't know for certain.
Yeah, thank you. Idle thought.
Well, it would make sense. I'd say they were doing those things on such a large scale that, like having their own stagger makers, they would need to produce all their own materials, really. It would not be economic to buy it in, I don't think, in that sort of quantity. But of course, so they were always experimenting. These were chemists. They were working on these glazes. They were working on these colors all the time. So they were always working on them, just to get one step ahead of their competitors, come up with something new. But they always stuck with blue and white. It's hard to explain. And why the other colors were never so popular. I don't think even the potterists themselves could explain it. But blue and white was always the thing.
I guess it probably looked clean.
Yes, yes. Well, that's what really distinguishes it from the pewter, which is what it took over from. Yeah. It was clean and bright and much healthier to eat from.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. I think that was fascinating. If nobody else has got any questions, Sylvia, welcome, Sylvia.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I used to have a lot of blue and white, but I gave it all to my sister, who had a lot of Chinese made blue and white, which is very old. So I was interested to learn of the connections.
Well, they say that the early porcelain, I'd say, is still collectible, although people will pay more money for a 20th century Clarice Cliff plate than they will for an 18th century sort of early English bow or Chelsea plate. It is quite discouraging, really, as to how cheaply it's possible to buy little worsted, little cut, perfect little thing, beautifully made, survived for 250 years, and you can buy it for a few pounds. Whereas a Clarice Cliff cut, they produced 1 million of those pieces of Clarice Cliff, will go for large money. So I don't like Clarice Cliff, as you probably
Nor do I.
But no, it is disheartening in some respects. But and this was known. What I was going to say, it's often known as crack porcelain because it came from the Carac. This is why I mentioned that the Katharina was a Carac, because it was captured from a Carac, so it became known as crack porcelain. So,
can you hear me?
It's floating around my head that I forgot. So.
Can you hear me if I talk?
Yes, we can hear whoever that is.
It's Margaret. I'm Helen Scott's mother, if that means anything to anybody. So I'm a long way away, and none of you know what I look like, so I haven't switched myself on. I wondered if you could tell me, when Delftware, which chips very easily, presumably is made of softer porcelain, is that right?
Delftware is earthenware. So it is the softer clay. Yes, it does damage easily.
But it does come in blue and white and with all those patterns.
Yes, yeah. As I say, that's what I say. What this one is.
Yeah.
You see this one. Yeah, it is very easily damaged and always was. The porcelain in many ways was harder wearing, but as I say, earthenware. Again, it's back to the firing. It doesn't fire at such a high temperature. It is not quite so hard wearing. It's even down to the composition of the clay, because the china clay that goes into porcelain is much finer than the heavier earthenware plates. So it does get damaged. For a collector that matters, but for nobody else really. But even collectors will put up with a little bit. They are getting hard to find. And so this one, which I say about 1760, it is quite literally in bits.
Gosh.
I'm very worried about picking it up. This was bought in a big collection of other broken bits, and how this has managed to stay together, I really don't know, because it is so fragile. But that's chipped and cracked, and it's still hanging on. And that one is saying well over 250 years old.
Lovely, thank you.
It lasts pretty well.
It has.
Yes.
Well, looks very good from here.
It looks perfect.
Yeah, there's probably
very good.
Yes, if you get too close, you see all the cracks.
Yeah. Leave it there and blow on it.
I say it doesn't get dusted very often. I daren't dust it.
Best not to. But Anthony, thank you very much.
That's my pleasure.
We'll look forward to the next talk in probably 2 weeks' time. We'll do it this side.
Probably 2 weeks' time. Yeah. If I can think of something to say. Yeah.
Thank you. Please do.
But meanwhile, thank you very much for everybody joining us.
Thank you.
And we'll look forward to seeing you all just before Christmas. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Sure.